Hi everybody, welcome back. We're now talking about what a mix bus is and some different ways that we can route audio. Every mixing console, physical or digital in your DAW, does exactly the same thing. It takes multiple signals from different channels, combines them together, and routes the tracks to an output of your choice. A mix bus is where all of those combined tracks are routed and merged together. So what is a master bus? The most popular mix bus is the basic main stereo mix bus, also called the master bus. You'll find it on every single mixing console. And one of my favorite consoles is the NE 5088. This is the same one that you'd see Deadmau5, that he has this guy. And you'd see here you've got this, that if you see where my cursor is, that's going to be your master fader or your stereo mix bus. So if I turn this up or turn this down, that's controlling every channel that we've got here. The mixing board takes all of the different instrument channels and combines them into a single pair of left and right channels, or if you've got the big time system, you've got surround, of course. And those channels are then output to your left and right speakers or your headphones, of course. The main stereo mix bus acts as your master control, where you can make final adjustments before the audio leaves your board or DAW hits the speakers. So most mixers will let you add different insert effects on the main stereo mix bus, like a limiter and EQ plugin. So as you can see here then, on our DAW, on Logic for example, I can look all the way to the right and you can see we've got our stereo out. That's our mix bus. And if I wanted to, I could insert, let's just say for example, some EQ and maybe a limiter or something like that, right? Now, continuing on, the main stereo mix bus is not the only mix bus that you can create your audio flow. And so what I want to show you is some ideas maybe potentially that we can use in order to group things together. Maybe, getting a nice glue, maybe using one compressor instead of using 7. There are 2 other types of mix buses that can significantly help you in your mixing process: subgrouping and busing to an auxiliary track or an aux track. So what is a subgroup versus a bus? A subgroup mix bus is a group of tracks controlled as a single group. Imagine if you want to add compression to 10 background tracks, or if you want to add compression to, in our case, a bunch of drums or a grouping of guitars. Remember in our Arise mix example, we have groupings of drums that we could utilize. We've got groupings of background vocals we can utilize. We've got groupings of guitars and keyboards, right? So in this case, what we'll look at in this example is 10 background tracks. You could do this track by track if we wanted to, and we could put compression on each track and everything else. Or what we could do is we could send these out or subgroup them out into one separate channel, and so that we could basically put compression on that channel, as you can see here with my cursor. So again, back to our notes, in doing so, you mix down all 10 tracks into one stereo channel. You could name that stereo channel BG or background vocals, and that bus in turn would output to the master bus. You can add your compression and EQ within that insert, and really you would be compressing all of them together, and there's a lot of advantages to creating that glue, right? Take a look at the diagram below and notice how a subgroup mix bus is created for drums. Each individual drum channel, which is the orange track, has been routed to output bus 10. So in turn, the drum bus channel has been set to receive input on bus 10. So all those individual channels mix down to a single stereo. So as you see here, bus 10 is all set. I'm going to show you this here too in our example of Arise. So how do we create a drum bus? The term bus can refer to any type of mix bus, but most often used to describe a subgroup mix bus. So in Logic, subgroups are called stacks. And so all we really need to do is just Control-click, and you'll see that it will give us the option to create a stack, and then it will group all of those together. It's very easy, and I'll show you here shortly. Pro Tools calls any kind of a bus an aux or an auxiliary. So if you're working with Pro Tools, you'll see that you're creating aux signals, and that's regardless of its function. So what are aux channels and the importance of routing? So another way that we could look at this, and I like using aux channels a lot of times for parallel compression or for reverb. And let me show you some examples here shortly as well. Auxiliary channels, referred to aux channels, are similar to group buses as they can receive input from multiple sources. Just like group buses, aux channels usually output to the master bus. They differ in their routing. Aux channels send a copy of the signal rather than sending the complete signal like group buses do. Sending a copy allows you to maintain the original signal untouched alongside your process track, So hence the word parallel compression or parallel effects, right? Giving you the independent control between these two signals. So for example, if you're using reverb, and I'm going to show this here shortly on our example of mixing with the track Arise that we've been working on, rather than inserting the reverb effect directly on each individual track, right? We could put reverb on the snare and the kick drum and each individual guitar and everything, but instead, maybe potentially what we could do is utilize reverb within a send, and I'll show you how that works. It's really easy. So we'll create a new bus. We'll use reverb in this case and insert the reverb effect on that bus and that auxiliary. Then we'll route the send of your track to the reverb bus, and this will send a copy of the guitar output or the drum output or whatever we decide, still sending the original signal wherever it was going, in case it'll be our master bus. That way you end up with two signals, one original dry signal and a copy of the track signal affected by the reverb plugin. So this means that you're able to have separate faders, giving you independent control over the dry original. So let's work with this. Now, first and foremost, again, I've got the track Arise. This is that reggae track that we had called up. And as you can see here, as we had done what we had done, we have compression on each individual track. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do just the opposite now. In this particular case, we're going to subgroup that compression, and I'm going to shut those off, or at least in this particular case, I'm just going to bypass each individual one. Now, let's find our drums only. And I want to subgroup those drums. And so going back to what we were talking about as far as subgrouping, let's just create a subgroup, which means that we are going to be sending our output. And let me show you how that works. It's really simple. So in this case now I've highlighted those tracks, right? And let's just go back to the actual track window. I'm going to highlight kick all the way down to each individual drum. So all the way down to cymbals. So I have 7 total. And all I do is control click. And you can see here it says create track stack. So that's the idea of that auxiliary, right? I create that track stack, and I'm going to create a summing stack. So what that's going to do then is it's going to give me one sum, as you can see here, and then it's folding each individual drum that I had in that. So if I wanted to, I could just lose them, and you can see I've got each individual drum inside. Isn't that great? So now you can see I have each individual track, of course, but if I wanted to, I could just simply put a compressor on everything. And let's just do that. So like in this case, maybe on the drums, the entire kit, we could put, some of this stuff, like in that case of the SSL, the mix bus. You see there? Soft distortion, everything that you've been trained to do. Make sure our threshold is close to 0. Nice and light, of course, right? But now I have those drums going through that SSL by way of this subgrouping. So if I wanted to then, I could turn down all of the drums simply by turning down this subgroup, for example. And if I wanted to just slowly bring in the drums, I've got control over everything. There's a lot of advantages to that. So if we look back now to our mixer, you can see here then, bus 1, all the way on our output, our tracks output are going to bus 1, which is then going to the input that we had just created for our subgroup. I put a little bit of compression within that subgroup, and then that sum is going to the output, stereo out, to the master fader. Let's keep doing that, repetition. So now that I've got my sum, my drum sum, in this particular case, right? Sum 1 is going to be our drum groupings. I can now just close that off basically, and if we wanted to, we can call that drums. So I've got my drum group. Now, maybe now having 4 guitars, I could group those 4 guitars together. You see the advantage? So first things first then, let's just select each one of those guitars and control click, create a stack, create a summing stack, and now I've got my guitars. And I'll name it that. Guitars group. Now, If I wanted to, I could just call up a compressor or something like that, which would allow me to be able to compress the guitars, all 4 guitars, within the same compressor. So maybe that's an advantage, maybe a disadvantage, but you have the choice to be able to do that. And some of the glue that you can create could be wonderful. Maybe you might use them all. So in this case, I'm going to sum them all together. All 4 guitars are coming through the 1176. And I'll just get the parameters set up exactly the way that you've been trained to do it. Now, we'll keep going. So now that I've got my guitar group set up, I can lose that. Now, notice I've got organs and piano, so we could call that a keyboard grouping, couldn't I? So then I'm going to shift those, and we'll just call that a keyboard grouping. Again, just simply going to Control-click, create a track stack, summing stack for my keyboards, right? So now we could just call this keys group. Now, compress all of the keyboards, maybe potentially within, I don't know, like the VCA, that red 7 or red Focusrite compressor, right? So I'll just call that up and just lightly compress, nice and transparent, nothing to it, just taking a little of the pick off of what we had, some of the highs, and bringing out some of the inconsistencies of the amplitude of the low. Lose our key group. Now I've got all these background vocals, see there? So let's just group all of those together. Look how clean our mix looks, isn't that great? So I've got these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 background vocals. Let's Control-click on those background vocals. Let's create a track stack. Summing stack, we've got that created now, and I can call that my background vocal, or BG vocal. On the background vocal, maybe potentially I want those to be compressed with a nice vintage fet. Get a little grain to it, maybe aggression. There we go. And perfect. Alrighty. Now I've got drum group. So if I wanted to turn up or down the drums, I could. I've got bass individual, which I did that on purpose, so I've got its own special compressor for the bass only. I've got the guitars in a grouping, so if I wanted to turn up or down the guitars, I could. The keyboards are now in a grouping. I don't have to worry about turning up each individual organ or the piano part. They can all now be controlled, as well as the background vocals. On top of that, if I look at the mixer, you can see each subgroup that I created, I'm compressing each subgroup together, which is creating a nice glue. So I think for some of you, you might find that that could potentially create a wonderful mix. Now, that doesn't mean that we couldn't go back to each individual track. As you can see here, this little triangle to the bottom left allows me to be able to have control over each individual hit in the drums case, or each individual guitar or keyboard. If you needed to get back to it, you could, which goes back and lends its hand to the importance of you being able to go through EQ and understanding, cutting certain things out. This doesn't take away from that. It just helps you organize. So, for example, some of you might in the future be working with electronic music, tracks and productions that could be upwards of 100 tracks. So I would say to you, subgrouping can really, really save you. And for me, it really does, not just necessarily in organization, but in processing power. So I hope that does help. And so if I go back to it, and we'll just kind of see certain things running, I'll just kind of show you how this can work. And so you can see here, access to my drums, right? There's that drum group.
Run, 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 Babylon and go come. Run, 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 Babylon and go come. Run, 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 him run. Wicked land and go wrong.
Just imagine creating, let's just say dropouts like that, for example, if you're creating a remix, maybe, there's a lot of advantages to subgrouping. Again, the subgrouping aspect, each individual track is being grouped together to a single track, which is then being outputted to your master fader. So you can see here the drum group has done just that. The guitar group is being outputted, bus 2, to the input of that bus group, which is going out to the master fader. The keyboard group, same thing. Bus 3 to the input of your track stack, which is then going out to your stereo out, of course, right? And last, your background vocals. All the background vocals, bus 4, by way of your track stack to the input of bus 4, going out to your master fader. It's really that easy. And as you could hear, not only does it not hurt your mix, it actually in many cases helps your mix. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't go back to your individual compression and everything else. You still can go back to it. And I think that many of you will find that it is limitless in what you can do. But creating a glue by combining all of these tracks together is really going to help. I think that many of you will find that that really helps create a cohesion between your tracks. And I think that it might be what some of you have potentially been missing in your mixes. So lastly, what we want to talk about is then our mix bus. Remember, we talked about the mix bus being able to control everything. And one of the things that we haven't done yet is we haven't put anything on top of the mix bus yet. And so let me just give you some ideas and something that's exclusive to Logic only. If you look up here at the top where you see setting, just click on setting and you can see that it's going to give you some factory settings that are only for mastering. You won't be able to find these settings anywhere else within, obviously within any other grouping, with exception to the master fader. So as you look here where it says mastering, up on the top of your setting, I'm just going to legacy, Logic, mastering. Now, one of the ones that I always pick is I like to look at the final wide. So if I see final ballad wide or final hip hop wide, it's not genre specific. It really just gives you a setting. It gives you presets. And as you can see here, it gives us a bunch of these inserts on our master fader. So one of the things I like to use, in this case, we don't necessarily need gain. Gain just allows you to be able to turn it up or turn it down. So we can potentially go without gain. Multimeter is kind of nice because remember that multimeter in this particular case is going to allow us to be able to see our stereo field. Let me show you what happens here. So seeing it centered is a good thing, but remember if I had everything panned off to one side, let me show you what happens.
Run, run, run. Babylon and go.
You see how everything is leaning to the left because of course what I've done is I've panned everything over, right? So it's a great way to analyze, and a big part of that of course is it's dealing with your stereo image. So I'll just go back, center everything.
Run, run, run.
Now that we're centered, you can see we're good to go, right? Now the multimeter is a good thing, but at the same token, it doesn't create any sound, and so really it's just a way to analyze. There's nothing more to it. Channel EQ. As you can see here, you're not making any cuts. This is just a way to just simply touch things, and it's, in this particular case, now that you know what you know, you're just adding a little bit of low end, right? There's nothing to it. That you're barely doing anything, but remember, you're affecting every single track. So this is the master fader. Think of this as like, painting your car. This is the final step, the final sheen that you're going to put on everything. So maybe this is a great way to go. Maybe, for some of you, just a little bit of EQ, a little bit of, touch of the low end and a touch of the highs that could just really tighten things up. But remember, we've already made our cuts and our boosts within the mix in itself. This is just to kind of create that glue or cohesion between each track. So be very subtle about your channel EQ. You don't want to start doing stuff like this, right? Go to the individual track if you feel like you need to go to that route. Now, as our EQ is set, my disclaimer, of course, is being very, very subtle about that. This is allowing you to be able to compress certain bands of your frequencies. And so I would suggest maybe potentially bypassing this And then if you wanted to, go back to each individual track and try to get, the punch out of the track that you need without having to use this particular compressor. So instead of compressing each individual band, so in this particular case, if this is on and this was up, you'd be compressing your lows, your mids, and your highs. My advice to you is try to do what you can within the track in itself. I wouldn't necessarily use that. Now, that's, of course, in my opinion, and I think that many of you will find that that's really going to hopefully help you. And in this case, one thing that I would use, however, is the direct mix. And so in this case, you might have a lacking spread. Maybe potentially you're listening to a track and you just feel like your track isn't as wide as other tracks that you're trying to judge with. In that case, what I find is that maybe potentially you might be able to spread out your stereo field a little bit, and that might help you. And so in this case, being very subtle about it, of course, in this track, as you see, if I spread it out too much, I lose a lot of the presence of the track. So we can make and or break it with this. And so I'd be very, very careful. But one thing I like to do is just touch it a little bit, maybe, right?
Run, 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 him run. Wicked Lana go wrong. Run, 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 him run. Babylon I go gone. Babylon, Babylon.
So we've got just a little bit of a spread going, and with that spread, it's going to allow us, hopefully, to bring out a little bit more if we can. As you can see, as I called up that direct mix, it just kind of brought things out just a little bit more, of course. And then what I'll be able to do now is, with that width, is I might be able to now turn it up just a touch. Create a, hopefully even closer to commercial level. And I'll show you what I've got here. And so what I've just called up then is Logic's limiter. And that's another one. And I think that this is probably one of the most important aspects to look at within your mix bus. We want to be able to stop it from going too far. But remember, if we start seeing a bunch of reduction, rest assured, we're going to be probably listening to some degradation in your tone quality. So we want to be very careful about this and very subtle about it. So with that, let me just kind of give you some ideas here what we could do. But at the same token, it's really easy. As you see here, the best settings, I think you want to be careful about having your out ceiling going set. If the out ceiling is set here, basically, then the signal, if it gets further than this -8 point, then you're going to see reduction. And so what we want to do is get it as close to 0 as possible so that when that reduction happens, it's almost at that 0 point. Let me show you how we're looking.
Babylon, Babylon, I go gone.
See, I'm a touch loud. You see that reduction's happening. So I'm going to be very, very careful, but at the same time, I still want to bring it out a little bit so we can match commercially, of course, right?
Oh, Babylon is coming to take it away. So you better run, run, run. Babylon I go gone. Say the wicked man I come. Babylon I come. You better run.
Now you can see I'm creating just a touch of reduction, but watch what happens if I take this away.
Say the wicked man I come.
The track just ducks back, of course, and we are now no longer matching to that commercial level. So I don't necessarily want you to feel like we're telling you to turn things up as loud as they could be. We're being very subtle about this. We've individually compressed each individual track in some cases. We've cut out the frequencies in all cases, of course, that we don't necessarily need. We've created glue within subgrouping. We're also, looking at this, as basically putting all of these tracks together to try to create a cohesion within each individual track in terms of processing. So I hope that helps as far as at least the individual track. Now, the last thing that we want to talk about is not necessarily just being able to process and get the best sound that we can out of each individual track, but we also want to be able to add some effects, to be able to simulate some of these ideas of, let's just say, the drums coming through a certain room, for example. So let me give you some ideas on what we can do here. As you can see, I've got my drum grouping set up. So now instead of looking at our outputs, we're going to be looking at our sends. That's just one setup here. And I'll just go very quickly here real quick. I'm going to highlight each individual track on our drums. And I'm just going to simply come in and I'm going to go bus 5. Now, bus 5 is going to create an auxiliary here. You see that? And on that auxiliary, I'm going to create a reverb. And going back to the lecture that you had, our drums, we want to be recorded through a plate reverb. Remember when we were looking at those? So I'm going to take my drums and look at there, they've got one for us. So I'm going to call up a medium plate for those drums. And this is the kicker. If I wanted a little bit of reverb, I'm going to turn it up here. You see how I'm clicking in that little center line? And I can put a lot of reverb to it or just a little. So I'm just going to turn this up just a little bit. My snare, I want a lot of reverb. My hi-hat, I want a lot of reverb. My overheads, I want just a little bit. They're just a little bit less than the others. My snares, I want a lot of reverb. And that cymbal, I want a lot of reverb. You see how I'm able to create a depth with amplitude on our send, and that sound, or this signal flow, is going out to our auxiliary, and now we can call this drum verb. So now our drum verb is that plate reverb, and our drums are coming through that plate reverb. And so now as I play this back, you'll see I've got a much more interesting drum sound.
Babylon, Babylon, go home. Wicked and the wicked man no wrong. Babylon, Babylon, go home.
Isn't that great? Now let's just say, for example, I want that bass to inch into that drum plate just a little bit. Let's just go to bus 5, and I'm going to just turn it up just a little bit. Now I have that bass also inching into that drum verb. Nice, right? Now that we've got our drums all set up and everything is happy within our sends, we will also want to send out our guitar grouping. But we're not going to send it into the same drum, right? Let's go and look at our guitar grouping. In our guitar, we have 4 of these guitars. So let's just highlight those 4 guitars that we've created. And I'm going to create another bus. One that we haven't used yet would be bus 6. So if I just go to bus 6 now, and you see my send has been created, it also creates our auxiliary. Let's call this guitar verb, right? And in this case, the little circle up on the top, I'm clicking on this is to create that stereo. And so it automatically comes up as mono. So I'm just clicking that to make it stereo. We'll call up a space designer, just like what we had done before. But now I want those guitars to come through something different. So maybe I could make those guitars go through a medium-sized plate, but it's different than that drum plate. I'll call it maybe that ice plate potentially. So now all of those guitar sounds, if we wanted to, we could make them come through this guitar verb. So the first guitar I might want a little bit of that plate. The second guitar I might want a little bit more potentially, but about the same, subtle. But that lead sound we want a lot. So the lead sound's going to get the most. And let's just judge it and see what we've got. So now we've got drum verb and we've got guitar verb. See what you see. Okay, so let's keep going. Guitars have their reverb. Now let's look at our keyboards. So we've got those 4. And we're going to look at this, and we've got to think about this specifically. The organ is in the room, the piano is in the room, so when they're recorded in the same space, right? So in this case, we wouldn't call it a plate. We would call this a room that we might want to simulate, right? So it's going to be a little different. We're going to still call it up in our send. So I could call it my bus 7, because we haven't used it yet, of course, right? And those are on our 4 keyboards. Now bus 7 is created within that auxiliary, and we'll call this keys. My keys reverb, and I'll call up a space designer. But in this case, remember, an organ and a piano are going to be in a room. So instead of calling up a plate reverb, let's call up let's say a medium room or a medium hall, right? So maybe I'll just call up a nice hall for that piano, for example. and for the organ, for example. And so let's look at the reflections. The lows, we would probably just have a little bit. The highs of the organ, we could have a lot. And the piano, let's have a lot. And just see what we've got. Now we've got our keyboard sounds sounding like they're coming through a room. We've got our guitar sounds coming through that plate reverb. And we've got our drum sounds coming through another separate plate reverb. Very professional, of course, at the same token, concepts that we're simulating digitally.
Babylon, my book on. You're coming to take it away. No, 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 far away.
Nice, right? So let's keep going. Our background vocals, now that we've got our keys set, let's just get our background vocals going. And again, same idea. Highlight each individual track. And we haven't used bus 8 yet. Bus 8 now will create an auxiliary, as you can see here. We'll call this our background verb. And make sure that it's stereo. Our background vocals, they would be recorded also maybe in a nice spot, but in this case maybe potentially a nice chamber. So I'll just come in here and let's just go to a nice room, chamber. And our vocals have now, our background vocals have now are perceived as going through this nice room. So take one, let's just kind of get a nice little depth. Take one, we'll put a bunch. Two, we'll just stagger it. You see how each individual one is a little bit different, just to create a nice depth. But at the same time, they're still being, fairly aggressive. And then the main judge is going to be when we check it out and see how it's going. Let's check it out.
Oh yes, oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh no. Babylon, I go gone. I say the Babylon, 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 ooh Babylon.
Okay. Now the last thing is that of course we have our lead that we haven't put anything to yet. So maybe our lead would be the only one that you could, start looking at being by itself in its own spot. Most importantly, though, that it should be that way. That's the lead. The lead should stand out, right? And so if it is the lead, you see here I created bus 9, and bus 9 is set. And we're just going to call up a little bit. Maybe what I could do for that lead is get a very tight space. Remember, our background vocals were in a medium space. The lead, I'm going to put into a small space. And we'll do a nice small room. Let's see here. This might be good. Let's see what we got.
Run, run, run. Babylon, I go gone. Run, run, run. Babylon, I go gone. Run, run, run. He run. Wicked man, I go wrong. Run, 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 he run. Babylon, I go gone.
We really have ourselves something here, right? Very professional mix. We're getting ourselves a very professional master within our mix bus, creating nice cohesion. Hopefully you're seeing that it's very easy to do. As you can see here, basically our subgrouping is that it's keeping everything contained. It's hopefully keeping everything nice and organized, but at the same time I really do hope that it's not confusing and it makes things easier for you, and that's the idea. For me, this is on the daily. It really is very, very important for me to be able to subgroup and to send things out. If I'm not working like this within this process, I'm really not being able to mix and master professionally the way that I've been trained to. So I really hope that this helps, and I hope that you find this is very simple. Most importantly, looking back to what we've talked about, obviously the application of what we've looked at here in the mix, I think is one that will hopefully help you push things over the top. But as you can see here within our notes, this is going to be the most important thing for you. So just make sure that when it comes down to it, this is really easy for you. Ask me anything. If you need anything, please let me know if you've got any questions. Most importantly, I think that when it comes down to it, I do hope that your mixes and your masters will be pushed over the top by these very simple concepts of what a mix bus is and how to utilize a mix bus, what subgrouping is, and essentially what an auxiliary is and the best way to bus things out. It's really, really quite simple. And at the same token, you take it from me, it's a lot of fun. So hopefully we'll see you guys soon. Take care, everybody, and let me know if you have any questions.